After my wife passed, I inherited $45 million, and in that very moment my son stepped forward with a demand that echoed through the room. Years of sacrifice and dedication seemed to hang in the air unspoken as his words shifted the course of the day. What followed was not grief alone, but the beginning of something none of us could have predicted, a turning point that would leave everyone waiting for what came next. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and comment where you are watching from. It began at the very instant the funeral flowers had not yet wilted, and my son looked me in the eye, not with sympathy or compassion, but with a demand for wealth he believed was rightfully his. And as I stood there, an old man weary from loss, yet holding the weight of an unexpected fortune, I realized that the battle ahead would not be with banks or with lawyers, but with my very own child, who saw me not as a grieving husband, but as a gatekeeper to riches. And while I tell you this, my mind drifts back to that day when the lawyer's envelope was placed into my hand, and my heart carried both the sorrow of farewell and the burden of what was to come. For inside that envelope lay not only the confirmation of inheritance, but also the seeds of betrayal. And I recall how the room seemed to shrink as my son's eyes lit up with hunger the moment the figure was read aloud, and how his lips curled into a smile that bore no resemblance to the boy I once taught to ride a bicycle or held when fevers shook his little body. For this was not the son of my memories, but a man consumed by entitlement, and in those minutes I could feel the decades of my labor roll back across my mind, the long nights driving trucks, the early mornings laying bricks, the sacrifices of youth when I skipped meals so there would be food on the table, and every dime saved so he could attend the best schools. Yet in his gaze there was no gratitude, no recognition, only the raw and naked expectation that I would hand over what had been entrusted to me. And though my heart ached with fresh grief for my wife, I knew that her spirit would not want me to yield so easily. For she too had endured hardship by my side, and together we had built the life that allowed such a fortune to exist. And I whispered inwardly that I would defend her legacy no matter what storm followed. But in that moment I held my tongue and simply watched, as my son leaned closer, his voice cold and confident, telling me that a man of my age could not possibly need such wealth, and that it was time to pass it down. And though my ears heard the words, my heart heard only the echo of all I had given him over a lifetime, and the silence that followed between us was heavier than the dirt that had just been laid over my wife's coffin. Because I knew then that the road ahead would not be one of shared mourning or mutual comfort, but of confrontation and lessons yet to be taught. And so as I begin this tale, I ask you to remember, not just the sum of money or the greed of one man, but the strength it takes for a father to stand firm against his own child when the values of respect and gratitude have been forgotten. And as you hear the rest of this story, you will understand how a fortune can reveal the true character of those closest to us, and why I, even in my old age, refused to surrender not only the wealth but the dignity and love that my wife and I had preserved through our lives, because some things are far more valuable than money, and in time my son would learn this truth, though not in the way he expected, and that lesson, I promise you, began right here in the shadow of my wife's passing and in the fire of my son's demand for what was never his to claim. The day of loss came like a storm I could not prepare for, and though I had known my wife's health was declining, nothing in this world can ready a man for the silence that follows when the person who shared his mornings and nights is no longer there to answer. And as I stood by her graveside, surrounded by the scent of fresh soil and the low murmur of prayers, I felt as if time itself had collapsed into a hollow space where laughter and comfort once lived, and the faces around me blurred into a sea of black attire and lowered eyes. but none of them could feel the weight that pressed upon my chest when I realized that after decades of companionship, I was walking forward into a life of solitude. And I recall the chill of the wind cutting through my coat as though the world itself sought to remind me that warmth had left with her. And when I returned home that night, the house itself seemed to mourn for the silence of the kitchen where pots no longer clattered, and the living room where her gentle humming no longer drifted through the air. And each step echoed louder than it ever had before, as though the walls wanted me to know that they too missed her presence. And I sat in her favorite chair and traced my fingers along the fabric she had chosen so carefully years ago, remembering how she loved to read by the window. And it was in that chair that the weight of the day broke me open, and I allowed the tears I had fought at the cemetery to flow freely, because no strength could keep them locked inside any longer. And as the night deepened, the loneliness settled like dust across the furniture, clinging to me with a heaviness that would not shake. And I thought of all the mornings I had taken for granted when her gentle hand on my arm would wake me, when her laughter at breakfast would chase away the gloom of a hard day ahead. And I realized that such moments, once overlooked, were in truth the jewels of my life, priceless and irreplaceable. And though friends and family sent their condolences and promised support, I found their words fleeting against the reality of an empty bed, a quiet table, and the long stretch of hours filled with echoes rather than voices. And as I sat there, I understood that grief is not a sudden blow, but a slow tide that rises and submerges a man until he is gasping for the air of old memories. And the more I tried to recall her voice, the more it slipped like sand through my fingers, leaving only the ache of wanting. And I lit the candle she always kept on the mantel, watching its flame flicker in the stillness, a fragile reminder that some part of her remained, that her light had not been fully taken. And in that moment, I promised myself that I would hold fast to her memory, to every shared hardship, to every joy, because to do anything less would be to betray the life we had built together. And while grief threatened to consume me, I knew I had to carry her legacy forward, to live in a way that honored her sacrifices, even if it meant walking alone. And as the night stretched on, I listened to the creak of the floorboards, the ticking of the old clock, and the whisper of the wind outside, and I thought to myself that this silence, though cruel, was also sacred, for within it I could still hear her if I listened with my heart. And so the day of loss ended not with closure, but with the beginning of a journey through sorrow. And little did I know that as I sat grieving, the very fortune she had left behind would soon become the spark that ignited a fire within my family, a fire that would test love, respect, and loyalty in ways I never imagined. And though I was not ready for it then, her passing marked not only the end of her presence, but also the start of a battle that would reveal the true face of my son and force me to stand stronger than grief alone could demand. Instead of finding comfort in my son's presence after his mother's passing, I was met with a reaction so cold it felt as if grief had skipped his heart entirely. For in the very hours when I sat with swollen eyes and trembling hands, longing for a word of solace, he turned the conversation not to memories of her kindness or to the sorrow of our loss, but straight to the matter of inheritance. And the shift was so sudden it left me stunned, because I had expected at least a brief embrace or a whisper that he shared in my pain. Yet his eyes seemed fixed not on me as a father who had lost his partner, but on the invisible numbers he imagined waiting in bank accounts. And I could hear the sharpness in his tone as he asked whether the will had already been read and what exactly had been left behind. And my chest ached with more than grief in that moment, because I realized I was speaking not to the boy I once cradled in my arms, but to a man who had let desire for wealth bury the tenderness of family. And as I listened to him, I could not help but recall the long hours I had spent working so he could grow up in comfort, the countless nights I came home, exhausted only to sit with him at the kitchen table to help with his school projects. And yet, all of that seemed erased from his memory, because before the soil had even settled on his mother's grave, he wanted to know what was his. And his words carried no hesitation as he reminded me that it was only natural for children to inherit, as if my age alone stripped me of any right to what my wife and I had built. And though my lips pressed in to silence, my heart thundered with disbelief, for I had never imagined that the first serious conversation after her passing would revolve around money rather than mourning. And as I watched him lean back in his chair with that expectant look, I felt as if a curtain had been pulled aside, revealing the truth of his nature in a way that grief made even sharper. And I thought of how his mother used to defend him, telling me he would grow into his kindness, that he only needed time to mature, yet here he was, grown and unmoved by loss, his voice carrying the chill of entitlement. And I sat there fighting the urge to shout, to tell him that he had no idea of the weight that rested on my shoulders, no idea of the emptiness that filled the house. And yet I remained calm, because anger would not bring her back, nor would it teach him what he had forgotten about respect. And in that moment I realized I was dealing not just with a grieving son, but with a man who saw opportunity where he should have seen family, and that was a wound deeper than any I had known. For when your own child speaks of wealth before wiping away the tears of loss, you cannot help but question where you went wrong. And I remember staring at him across the table, searching his face for even a flicker of sorrow, some trace of the boy who once ran into his mother's arms after school. But all I saw was calculation, and the more he spoke, the clearer it became that in his mind the money was already his, as though my role was merely to hand it over. And I sat there realizing that my grief would have no ally in him, that the comfort I longed for would not come from the very child I had raised. And though it pierced me deeply, I also knew then that I would have to prepare myself for what was coming. For if he could so easily cast aside his mother's memory in pursuit of inheritance, then the road ahead would be one of conflict. And I whispered silently to her memory that I would stand firm, that I would not let greed tarnish the love we had built, even if it meant standing alone against my own flesh and blood. And in that cold exchange, I felt the first sparks of a storm rising, a storm that would test the limits of loyalty and the resilience of a father who had already given more than his share. I remember the years of sacrifice more clearly now than ever before, because when my son looked at me with that expression of entitlement, I could not help but drift back to the days when I was younger and stronger, when every sunrise meant another set of hours laboring to keep food on the table and dreams within his reach. And I can still feel the ache in my hands from those long shifts at the factory where the machines roared louder than my own thoughts. Yet I never complained, because I believed that one day my son would live a better life than mine. And I recall how many nights I took on extra work, driving trucks through rain and snow, my eyes stinging with fatigue, just so I could afford the tuition that sent him to the finest schools. And I would return home with my clothes soaked in sweat or chilled from the winter air. And my wife would look at me with that quiet pride that reminded me it was all worth it, because we were building something bigger than ourselves. And when my son came home with new clothes, gadgets, and all the things his classmates had, I felt a quiet joy in knowing that he never had to feel the sting of going without, for I had known that sting too well in my youth. And when he wanted to join sports teams or music lessons, I never said no, even if it meant I had to skip meals or wear the same worn-out coat for another year, because his opportunities mattered more than my comfort. And when the time came for university, I remember signing loans and emptying savings just so he could walk onto a campus that I could never have dreamed of entering. And I watched from afar as he lived in dorms, traveled abroad, and tasted luxuries that were never part of my world. And each time I heard his voice on the phone asking for a little more money, I sent it, even if it meant delaying the bills at home, because I trusted that one day he would see the sacrifices behind every dollar. But as I sit here now replaying those memories, I cannot help but wonder if he ever truly noticed, for his requests grew larger with the years and my shoulders grew heavier. Yet I never stopped, because a father's love is measured not by what he keeps, but by what he gives. And in those days, my wife often warned me that we were giving too much, that our son was becoming accustomed to ease, but I silenced her fears with the hope that generosity would breed gratitude. And now I see that perhaps I was wrong, because all those nights of aching bones and weary eyes seem invisible to him, and all those sacrifices that I thought would weave a bond between us appear instead to have built a sense of entitlement. And though it pains me to admit it, I realize now that love given without limits can sometimes be mistaken for weakness. And as I sit in the quiet of this house, filled with memories of struggle and triumph, I know that the years of sacrifice were not wasted, for they gave my wife and me moments of pride when we saw him succeed. But they also taught me the cost of giving without teaching respect, and that realization sits heavy in my chest, because when he demanded the inheritance, he was not just asking for money, he was dismissing the life we had poured into him. And though my heart breaks to think it, I must accept that the sacrifices I made were not enough to shape the man he became, and that truth, though bitter, steels me for the decisions I must now make. For if I gave in once again, I would not only dishonor my wife's memory, but also betray the very meaning of the sacrifices that brought us here. The day of the will reading is etched into my memory as sharply as the day of her funeral, because while grief still sat heavy on my shoulders, I walked into the lawyer's office with a mixture of dread and uncertainty, and the air of that room carried both the scent of polished wood and the weight of unspoken expectation. And I remember sitting across from the man in his dark suit as he adjusted his glasses and opened the folder that contained my wife's final words. And in that instant, I felt her presence linger, as though she too was watching over what would be revealed. And when he began to read, my heart pounded, because each sentence was more than legal language. It was her voice echoing from beyond the grave. And though my son sat beside me with his arms folded, leaning forward with impatience, I listened carefully to every word, and the lawyer spoke of her love for me, of the decades we shared, of the trials we endured, and the sacrifices we both made. And then came the revelation that silenced the room, for she had left everything, all $45 million, and the entirety of her estate, solely to me. And in that moment I felt both humbled and overwhelmed, because this was not just a fortune, but a symbol of trust, a declaration that she believed I would honor her wishes and guard the life we had built. And as the lawyer continued, I could sense my son shifting uneasily in his seat, his anticipation turning to confusion, then to disbelief. And though the words were clear, he could not accept them, for she had entrusted it all to me without mention of him and Will E. I sat there stunned by the enormity of her decision. I also felt the weight of responsibility pressing down upon me, because this inheritance was not simply wealth, but her legacy, the result of every sacrifice, every hardship, and every triumph we had shared. and it was now my duty to preserve it. And as the lawyer closed the folder and looked to me with a solemn nod, I felt the sting of tears in my eyes. Not for the money, but for the message she left me, for she had chosen me to carry forward what we built. And though I wanted to speak, my throat tightened with emotion, and silence hung between us all, broken only by the faint hum of the office clock. And in that silence, I felt her love wrap around me one last time, a reminder that even in death she trusted me above all. And though my son's gaze burned into me with unspoken anger, I kept my composure, because I knew that moment was not about him or his expectations, but about honoring her memory. And as I rose from my seat clutching the documents that confirmed what I had been given, I whispered inwardly to her that I would not fail her, that I would protect what we had earned and ensure that it was never squandered. And while my son stormed out ahead of me, slamming the door in frustration, I walked slowly behind with the calm of a man who had just been handed both a gift and a trial, for the reading of the will did not end with the distribution of wealth. It marked the beginning of a battle between father and son, a battle that would test the strength of blood, loyalty, and the true meaning of legacy. And though I did not yet know the storms that would follow, I knew in my heart that I had been chosen to stand firm, and that knowledge alone gave me the resolve I would need for the days ahead. When I shared the news with my son that his mother had left everything solely to me, his reaction was not the grief or respect I had quietly hoped for, but an eruption of anger so fierce it shook me to my core. For his voice rose louder with each word, as though the very idea of me being the heir was an insult to him. And he accused me of selfishness, of betrayal, of stealing what he believed was his by right. And in that moment I saw not the boy I had raised, but a man whose heart had been twisted by entitlement, and the veins in his neck strained as he shouted that his mother would never have chosen such a thing, that the lawyer must have been mistaken, and that I had somehow manipulated her into this decision. And though I tried to remain calm, my chest burned with the weight of his accusations. For to be called a thief in the shadow of my wife's passing was a wound deeper than any other, and yet I held my ground because I knew the truth. I had been by her side through every decision, through every plan we made, and I knew she had trusted me above all. And as he pounded the table with his fist, his eyes carried a wildness I had never seen before, a fire stoked not by loss but by greed, and he spat words that cut deeper than he realized, telling me that I had lived my life and that my time was done, that the money belonged to the younger generation, and each syllable echoed like a hammer on stone, because I could hear in his voice not just anger but conviction, as though he truly believed I no longer mattered. And while my heart broke, I also felt a strange clarity, because was the moment I understood fully what I was up against, not just the disappointment of a son, but the wrath of a man who saw wealth as the measure of love. And as he raged, I let him speak, for silence can sometimes be stronger than reply. And though I wanted to remind him of the nights I carried him in my arms, of the times I gave up my own needs to fulfill his, I knew it would fall on deaf ears. Because in that moment he was blinded by a vision of riches slipping from his grasp, and when he finally paused, his chest heaving with fury, I told him quietly that the will was clear, that his mother had spoken with love and certainty, and that I would honor her wishes without bending, and his face twisted with disbelief before hardening into rage once more. And he shouted that if I truly loved him, I would hand over what I had been given, and I sat there feeling the sting of those words, for love had never been about money. Yet here he was, equating one with the other, and when he stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him, I remained seated, staring at the papers in my hand, my heart heavy not with the weight of the inheritance, but with the realization that my son's love for me had been poisoned by greed, and in that silence I whispered to my wife once more, promising her that I would endure, that I would not allow anger or accusation to shake me, because what she had entrusted to me was not just wealth, but the duty to preserve our legacy. And though the pain of his words lingered like a bruise on my soul, I knew that my resolve had to be stronger than his fury, for this was only the beginning of a conflict that would demand every ounce of strength I still had left in me. It was not long before his wife, my daughter-in-law, revealed the full measure of her own ambition. For while I had always hoped she might temper my son's impulses with wisdom, I soon learned she was the one fanning the flames of his greed. And I remember the evening she came to my house with that smile that carried no warmth, sitting across from me at the same table where her children had once eaten cookies baked by my wife. And in that very room she leaned forward and spoke in a voice low and sharp, saying that a man my age could not possibly need so much money, that it was only right for me to hand it over to them so they could secure their future. And she dressed her words as if they were concerned for my well-being, asking what I would even do with such wealth. But beneath the veil of politeness, her tone carried the weight of expectation, and it was clear she had already planned how she and my son would spend what they had not earned. And as she spoke, I noticed how her eyes darted with calculation, as though she were measuring not only the fortune but also the strength of my resolve. And though I said little, I could feel her trying to press into my silence, reminding me that I was not getting any younger, that I should think of the grandchildren, that my role now was to step aside and let the next generation take over. And each word struck me like a chisel against stone, for I could hear the echo of disregard in her voice, a dismissal of the years my wife and I had worked and saved. And though my heart ached with grief, I sat steady, because I understood what she was doing. She was planting seeds in my son's mind, watering the soil of his entitlement with whispers of urgency and greed. And I remembered the way she had always looked at my house, my car, even my watch, as though they were already hers. And now that the inheritance was real, she wasted no time in trying to claim it. And as I listened, I thought of my wife, how she had once told me she worried about this woman's influence, that she saw something shallow in her eyes. But I brushed it aside, believing love would guide my son. Yet here I was, years later, watching her true nature reveal itself. And though my chest burned with anger, I kept my words calm, because I knew that if I showed even a crack, they would see it as weakness. And when she finished her speech with a rehearsed sigh, as if she carried the weight of responsibility, I simply nodded and told her that my wife's wishes had been clear, that the inheritance was entrusted to me, and her lips tightened, though she tried to keep her smile, and I could almost hear her mind racing with schemes. And in that moment I understood that the battle ahead would not only be with my son, but with the woman who now stood behind him, whispering poison into his ear. And I vowed silently that I would not allow her greed to dismantle the legacy my wife and I had built with our blood and our sweat, for though she thought her words could bend me, she would soon learn that age does not weaken resolve when it is fueled by love. And as she rose to leave, her perfume lingered in the air like smoke after a fire, a reminder that this was not the end of her efforts, but only the beginning. And I sat alone in the quiet house once more, whispering to my wife that I would not fail her, not against my son, not against his wife, not against anyone who sought to steal what we had spent a lifetime building. It was only a few days later when my son came to me again, this time without any disguise of courtesy, and his voice carried the weight of an ultimatum that pierced deeper than any argument before. For he demanded outright that I give him a large portion of the inheritance immediately, not a loan, not a gift, but a transfer of wealth he believed was his. And he sat across from me with his wife at his side, her eyes sharp, and her hand resting on his arm as though she were guiding every word, and he declared that if I refused, he would cut me off from his life entirely, and worse, he threatened that I would no longer see my grandchildren, and those words struck like a blade because the thought of losing the laughter of those innocent children, who carried the sparkle of their grandmother in their eyes, was almost too much to bear. And yet I could see in his face that he meant every syllable, that he was willing to use them as leverage to bend me to his will, and my chest tightened with both pain and anger because I had once believed a father's love for his child was enough to ensure respect, but now I saw that love was being twisted into a weapon against me. And I remembered the nights I had spent rocking him to sleep when colic racked his little body, the days I had worked double shifts to pay for the very toys and comforts he now provided for his own children, and to have those memories thrown aside in exchange for money was a cruelty I never expected. And I sat silently as he pressed on, his words heavy with arrogance, telling me that I had enjoyed my life and that it was time to hand the baton to him, that he was ready to take the fortune and build his empire. And the more he spoke, the clearer it became that he no longer saw me as his father, but as an obstacle in the way of his imagined future. And though the threat of losing my grandchildren stung like fire in my veins, I held my ground because I knew giving in would mean betraying not only myself, but the very legacy my wife had entrusted to me. And I told him calmly that love is not measured in dollars, that his mother's wishes were not to be dismissed, and his face darkened with rage at my refusal, and his wife leaned in with that cold smirk as if she had won something, whispering that I was being selfish, that I would regret choosing money over family. And though the words were meant to break me, they only steeled my resolve, because I could hear the echo of my wife's voice telling me to stand firm. And when they left that night, slamming the door so hard the walls shook, I sat alone in the silence of my home and let the weight of their ultimatum settle. And I knew this was not a passing quarrel, but a line drawn in the sand, and though my heart longed for reconciliation, I also knew that some lessons could only be learned through consequences. And if my son insisted on testing me this way, then I would meet him with a strength he did not expect. For though I am old, I am not weak. And I promised myself that I would protect both the memory of my wife and the dignity of the life we had built, even if it meant facing the unbearable cost of distance from my grandchildren, because some things are worth more than money, and respect is one of them. As I sat in the stillness of my home after their ultimatum, I could not stop my mind from wandering back through the years, through all the moments when my son's entitlement had already begun to show itself, long before this inheritance ever came into question. And the memories came not as isolated flashes, but as a long thread of sacrifices taken for granted, and I remembered the first time he overspent while in college, calling me in a panic that he had maxed out his credit cards, and I, though strapped for money myself, wired him the funds to clear the debt because I could not bear to see him fail. And then there were the years after his graduation, when instead of working steadily, he drifted from one job to another, always chasing a grand idea, always insisting that success was just around the corner if only he had more capital. And each time he came to me, I opened my wallet, sometimes emptying my savings just to give him the chance he swore he needed. And I thought of the house he now lives in, a house I helped him purchase when his own finances fell short, and how his car, his vacations, even the very comforts he now enjoys, were often padded by the quiet support of my labor. And I recall my wife's worried looks when I told her again and again that our son needed help, that if we did not step in, he might drown. But I see now that what we believed was rescue became a pattern of indulgence, and I think of the countless times he returned with excuses rather than gratitude, promises instead of repayment, and how I swallowed my disappointment each time because I wanted to believe he would grow into responsibility. Yet here I am, old and weary, facing the truth that the very habits we nurtured in him have grown into this towering sense of entitlement. And I cannot deny that we played a role in shaping his belief that we would always be there to bail him out. And though the memories ache, I do not regret loving him, for love guided every choice I made. But love without boundaries becomes a chain that binds a man to his own sacrifices. And I realize now that I must break that chain, that this inheritance is not just money, but a final chance to teach him what he should have learned long ago. And as I sit here reliving each bailout, each signed check, each sleepless night of worry over his debts, I feel both sorrow and resolve. Sorrow because I wanted more for him, not only in wealth but in wisdom, and resolve because I now see that the only way forward is to stand firm, to stop enabling the cycle of entitlement. And though my heart still longs for the son I once knew, the boy who laughed at my jokes and held his mother's hand with tenderness, I must face the man he has become, a man who sees me as a vault to be opened rather than a father to be honored. And in this realization, I know the coming days will not be easy, for his demands will grow louder, his anger fiercer, but I also know that my silence has been too long, that it is time to show him that not everything can be taken for granted, that some lessons must be earned, and as I whisper once more to the memory of my wife, I tell her that I finally understand the wisdom in her warnings, that I finally see clearly the consequences of years spent giving without asking for gratitude. And I vow to her that I will not let this inheritance become another indulgence, that I will turn it into the final lesson our son needs, even if he resents me for it, because love is not only about giving, it is also about teaching, and now is the time for that teaching to begin. The breaking point came on a quiet afternoon when I thought perhaps the storm had passed. Yet my son arrived unannounced with his wife at his side, and instead of softening his approach, he came armed with words sharper than before, declaring flatly that if I did not hand over the fortune, he would cut me out of his life completely, and that I would never again see my grandchildren. And as those words echoed through the living room, I felt as though the very air had been ripped from my lungs, because those children were not bargaining chips, they were innocent souls who had no place in this war, and yet he used them as leverage with a coldness that chilled me deeper than winter ever could, and I stared at him in disbelief, seeing not only his anger but also his conviction that this was the way to bend me. And his wife sat there with her arms folded and a smirk that told me she approved of every syllable he spoke, and I realized then that their unity was built not on respect for family, but on hunger for money. And though my heart ached with the thought of being cut off from the little ones whose laughter had filled my home with light, I knew that to give in would be to betray everything my wife and I had built. For this fortune was not a gift to be squandered, but a legacy earned through sacrifice. And I thought of the nights she had sat by my side mending clothes while I counted the bills from another long day's labor, and I thought of the years she had gone without new dresses or vacations so that we could save for the future. And I knew in that instant that if I gave it all away simply to appease my son, I would dishonor her memory. And so I looked at him with a steadiness I had not felt in years, and told him that love is not measured by what is handed over, but by the respect shared between us. And though my voice was calm, his reaction was anything but. For he stood abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. and he declared that I had chosen money over family, that I was a fool clinging to wealth I would not live long enough to enjoy. And then he turned his back to me, gathering his children and his wife, and as the door slammed behind them, the silence that followed was deafening, heavier than any silence I had known since my wife's passing. And I sat there gripping the arm of my chair, torn between sorrow and resolve. Sorrow, because I feared the distance that now stood between me and my grandchildren, and resolve because I knew I could not bend, not now, not after all that had been demanded. And in that silence I whispered to my wife that I had chosen to honor her, that I would endure the loneliness if it meant preserving what we had sacrificed for. And though my heart broke in that moment, I also felt the first flicker of strength return, a strength that told me I was not defeated, that I still held the power to protect her legacy, and that no amount of threats would sway me from that path. Because some things, even to an old man, are worth standing firm against. And this, I knew, was one of them. In the days that followed my son's ultimatum, I felt the wound of his words, but I also felt a quiet determination rising in me. For Thaug I was weary with grief. I knew that my wife's legacy deserved more than to be squandered in the hands of those who saw only numbers and possessions, and I decided then that I would no longer sit idle, waiting for their next demand, but instead I would act with resolve. And so I sought out professionals, men and women whose business it was to guard fortunes from grasping hands. And I remember sitting in the office of a lawyer whose shelves were lined with thick volumes of law, explaining to him, through tired eyes, that I wished to place the inheritance beyond the reach of anyone who might try to take it. And he listened carefully, nodding with the understanding of a man who had seen families torn apart by greed before, and then he began to draw up plans that would make the wealth secure in trusts and structures no one could easily unravel. And from there I moved to the banker, a sharp-eyed woman who spoke with precision, and she too understood my intent, guiding me through steps to move investments into safe places where reckless hands could not touch them. And as I signed papers and transferred accounts, I felt a burden lifting, because each signature was not just ink on paper, but a shield placed between my wife's memory and the storm of entitlement that threatened it. And though my heart still ached from the thought of strained bloodlines, I reminded myself that I was not acting out of spite, but out of love, out of a duty to protect what she and I had built with sweat and sacrifice. And I thought of her voice on those nights when she would worry about the future, telling me that she trusted me to make wise choices. And those words echoed in my ears as I sealed documents and finalized arrangements. And though my son believed me to be passive, perhaps even weak, the truth was that I was quietly building walls around the fortune, walls higher and stronger than his demands could ever climb. And when I left those offices and walked back into the cool air of the city streets, I carried with me not only papers, but also a sense of peace, because I knew I was doing what she would have wanted. And as the days turned into weeks, I continued to work quietly with these professionals, fine-tuning every detail, ensuring every account was guarded, every clause ironclad. And I never once spoke of it to my son or his wife, for there was no need to announce strength to those who only recognized weakness. And in the solitude of my evenings, I would sit by the candle she once lit and whisper to her that the battle was not yet over, but that I was ready, that I was armed not with anger or resentment, but with the resolve to protect her gift. And though the loneliness pressed heavy upon me, I also felt the steady rhythm of purpose, and that purpose gave me strength enough to endure what was to come. For I knew the day would arrive when my son would once again come knocking, certain that he could bend me, and on that day he would learn that his father was not a man to be undone, not by threats, not by greed, not by the weight of entitlement, because love for a wife and respect for her legacy can forge steel even in an old man's heart. In the quiet weeks that followed my meetings with lawyers and bankers, I carried myself as though nothing had changed, for I knew the best way to protect what I had done was to let my son believe I remained passive and unguarded. And so I moved through my days with the same slow steps of an old man, sitting in my chair, drinking my tea, answering his occasional calls with little more than nods and hums, all while behind the scenes every account was being shifted, every asset secured, every loose end tied so tightly that no argument or demand could unravel it. And the silence of my home became my ally, because in that silence I planned, I signed, I confirmed transfers, and though my heart still longed for the days when family filled these walls, I found new strength in the steady progress of each safeguard. And I recall the moment I placed the final document in the lawyer's hands, his eyes meeting mine with a nod that told me the fortress was complete, and I walked out into the sunlight with the calm satisfaction of a man who had quietly prepared for battle. And yet when my son came by with his wife, they saw none of this. They saw only the father they believed was weary and pliable, and their words carried the same sharpness as before. Little jabs about my age, suggestions that I ought to start considering what good the money was doing sitting in my hands, and I let them speak, never revealing the truth, for silence was now my greatest weapon. And as they left with smug smiles, I whispered to myself that the seeds of their arrogance would soon meet the wall I had built, and each night I lit the candle by her chair and told my wife that I had done it, that her legacy was safe. And though the loneliness pressed heavily against me, the knowledge of what I had accomplished gave me comfort. For I knew that no matter what storm they brought to my doorstep, they would find nothing but steel and stone. And in that silence I prepared myself, not for the possibility of their anger, but for the certainty of it. And I knew when it came, I would meet it with the calm of a man who had already won, because preparation is victory long before the first blow is struck. My son's arrogance grew unchecked in the weeks that followed, and while I sat quietly in my home with the knowledge that every account and every asset had already been secured beyond his reach, he strutted through life as though the fortune were already his, and I began to hear whispers from relatives and neighbors who told me how he spoke so boldly at gatherings, boasting about the money he would soon inherit and the plans he had already set in motion, and they told me of the way he puffed his chest and promised investments, vacations, and new businesses, as though the wealth were sitting in his pocket waiting to be spent. And each story reached my ears like the toll of a bell, not because it frightened me, but because it revealed just how deeply he had surrendered to his own illusions, and I could almost picture him standing among his friends with that smug grin, talking of millions as if he had earned them, never realizing that the ground beneath his feet was already crumbling. And I thought back to all the times I had watched him as a boy brag about things he did not truly achieve, how he once told his classmates that he had built a model plane when in truth it was I who glued the pieces together late into the night, and how he had taken credit for successes that were the fruit of others' labor. And I realized then that the arrogance I saw now was not new. It had always been there, only smaller, only easier to excuse, but now it had grown into a full beast, fed by entitlement and pride. And as the days passed, his arrogance reached even my ears directly, for he called me one afternoon, speaking not as a son, but as a man, certain of his triumph, telling me to prepare myself for the handover because soon he would take charge of the family's fortune, and he laughed as though it were a done deal. And I let him laugh. I let him speak, offering only silence and a few quiet words of acknowledgement, because I wanted him to believe his own fantasy a little longer. For arrogance, unchecked, grows into carelessness, and I knew that when the truth finally arrived, it would strike him with a force far greater than my warnings ever could. And in those moments of solitude after his calls, I would sit by my wife's chair and imagine her smile, imagine her telling me to stay the course, to remain strong, and I promised her again and again that I would not falter, that I would protect what we had built even if my son mocked me to the world. And as the days turned into nights, I could feel the storm gathering, because arrogance, such as his, cannot rest until it meets resistance. And though he paraded around with his boasts, I knew he would soon come pounding at my door again, convinced that pressure could bend me. And I prepared myself for that confrontation with the calm of a man who knows his fortress is complete, and while others shook their heads at his behavior, I simply waited. For I understood that a lesson delivered in time and silence is often the most powerful of all. And when the day came that he would demand again, the pride he had paraded before others would make the sting of truth all the more bitter. And though I dreaded the pain it might bring to our bond, I also knew it was necessary, because arrogance, unchallenged, destroys not only the man who carries it, but also all who stand near him, and I would not allow my wife's legacy to be swallowed by such a fate. So I held firm, steady, in the knowledge that the greater his arrogance grew, the greater his fall would be when the truth was finally revealed. The confrontation I had been expecting finally came on a heavy afternoon when the sky outside was gray and the air inside my home felt thick with silence. And without warning, my son barged through the door as though the house no longer belonged to me. His voice already raised before he even crossed the threshold, and he demanded once again that I turn over the inheritance, his eyes blazing with a fury that seemed to have grown stronger with every passing day of his delusion, and he stood before me with the arrogance of a man who believed his victory was certain, convinced that if he shouted loudly enough, if he pounded his fist hard enough, he would wear down the resolve of an old man. But what he did not know was that my silence over the weeks had not been weakness, it had been preparation. And I sat in my chair calm and steady, watching him with the patience of someone who already knew the outcome of the battle, and he ranted about how he had already made promises to his friends, how he had spoken of ventures he would soon fund, how he had bragged of the luxury he would provide for his wife and children, and each word was drenched in entitlement, each sentence spilling with the certainty that I was only a step away from surrendering. And though his anger rolled over me like waves, I did not flinch, for I had weathered storms far greater in my life, storms of hunger, storms of loss, storms of labor that left my body broken and weary, and compared to those, his shouting was nothing but the noise of a spoiled child who had grown into a man without gratitude. And as he moved, closer, his face red, his words sharper, I let him speak until his throat grew hoarse, until his fists shook at his sides, because I wanted him to feel the emptiness of his own fury. And when at last he paused to catch his breath, demanding that I answer him, I looked at him with steady eyes and asked him quietly what he truly believed made him worthy of such wealth. And for a moment his lips parted without sound, for it was a question he had never asked himself. And then he shouted again that he was my son, that blood alone entitled him, and I felt the sting of those words, because they revealed all too clearly how little he understood about the meaning of family. For blood is not a key to riches, it is a bond of respect and love, and without those, blood is nothing but shared name and shared history. And I told him then in a calm voice that shook not from fear but from conviction, that the inheritance he so desperately demanded was not his, that it had been entrusted to me by his mother, and that I had already ensured it was protected beyond his reach. And the silence that followed was heavier than any noise he had made before, for in that moment the ground beneath his arrogance began to crumble. And I watched as disbelief flickered in his eyes, disbelief that the father he thought he could bully had already secured every cent. And though his anger surged once more, though he shouted and cursed, the truth had already settled between us like an unmovable stone. And I told him that nothing he said, no threat, no demand, no fury, could undo the decisions already sealed in law and paper. And that realization struck him harder than my words ever could. And though he raged on, deep down he knew the truth, that the battle he thought he was winning had been lost before it began. And as he stormed from the room, I remained seated, steady and unbroken, because I knew the confrontation I had feared was finally behind me, and that the storm he carried in his chest had met the wall I had built. And though I mourned the son I once knew, I also felt the strength of a man who had honored his wife's wishes and refused to let arrogance and greed dictate the end of our story. When the door closed behind him after that confrontation, I sat in silence and let the weight of what I had just revealed settle into the air. For I had told my son plainly that he would not see a cent, and that every part of the fortune was secured, in a way no anger or demand could undo, and the look on his face in that moment is one I will never forget, a mixture of disbelief and betrayal. But beneath it all the unmistakable shock of a man who had built his world upon an illusion only to see it shattered in an instant. And as he stood there staring at me, I could see his mind racing, searching for cracks in my words, trying to convince himself that I was bluffing. But when he saw the calm in my eyes, he knew it was true. And I watched his shoulders slump for just a second before rage filled the void again. Yet no amount of shouting could change the fact that the law itself now stood as my shield. And I told him in clear, steady tones that his mother's wishes were not negotiable, that she had chosen me to carry the legacy we built, and that I would not betray her by giving it away to greed. And though he tried to argue that it was unfair, that he deserved it, I reminded him that fairness is not measured by entitlement but by sacrifice. And I asked him what sacrifice he had made for this wealth. What nights he had worked until his body ached, what meals he had skipped, what years of toil he had endured, and his silence was my answer. For he had no memory of such things, only the expectation that fortune should fall into his hands without effort. And I told him then that money cannot replace love, respect, or family. And that if he had chosen to honor me as a father instead of pressuring me as a rival, our conversation might have been different. But he had made his choice, and I could see in his eyes that the realization cut deep, because it was not just about the fortune, but about the truth he had tried so hard to ignore, the truth that his arrogance had blinded him. And though his anger burned brighter than ever, I remained steady, because I had spoken not only the truth of the inheritance, but the truth of our relationship. And in that moment I felt the strange calm of a man who had faced the storm and stood unshaken. And while I knew his fury would not fade quickly, I also knew that nothing he could do would undo what had been secured. And as he left the room that day, slamming the door with the same violence he carried in his words, I sat back in my chair and whispered to my wife that I had done it, that I had stood firm, that I had not allowed his demands to undo her trust. And though the silence of the house pressed against me once more, it carried with it a new strength, because I knew the lesson had been delivered. even if he refused to hear it in that moment, and the inheritance was safe, the legacy intact, and my resolve stronger than it had ever been. For I had proven to myself and to her memory that I could face even my own son's wrath without bending, and that knowledge gave me peace even in the shadow of his rage. His shock lingered long after the confrontation, for though he had left my home with fury in his steps, I soon heard from hers, how he began to falter, how the certainty he had paraded for weeks dissolved into quiet disbelief. And neighbors whispered that they had seen him pacing his yard, muttering under his breath. His shoulders slumped in a way that betrayed the weight of his realization, and I imagined him sitting at his own table, replaying my words, searching for a loophole, yet finding none. Because every document had been sealed, every account fortified, and the truth pressed upon him like a stone he could not move. And I thought of how he had once been a boy who dreamed of the impossible, who believed his father could fix anything, and how cruelly ironic it felt that now as a man he looked at me not with trust, but with resentment for not bending to his will. And I admit my heart wavered when I considered the pain of that distance, but the memory of my wife gave me strength. For I knew she had trusted me to carry her wishes through storms such as this, and I would not fail her, even if it meant watching my son wrestle with disappointment. And the more I heard of his behavior, the more I realized he had never prepared himself for this outcome. For his life had been built on expectation, on believing that I would always step in, always provide, always hand over what he demanded. And now, for the first time, he faced a wall he could not climb, and though it pained me as a father to know he was suffering, I also knew it was the only way he might finally learn the value of humility. And I pictured him sitting with his wife, her sharp words echoing in his ears, perhaps blaming me, perhaps blaming I am. But either way, the fortress they thought they were storming had already proven impenetrable, and their arrogance had led them to a place where they had nothing to show but anger and frustration. And I wondered if in those quiet hours of the night he thought back to the sacrifices of his mother and father, if he considered for even a moment the weight of what had been given to him through the years, or if the fog of greed still blinded him to those truths. And though I doubted his pride would allow such reflection easily, I held on to a small hope that one day he might, for every fall carries with it the chance of awakening. And while his shock was painful for him, it was also necessary, because without it he would never see the truth of his own actions. And as I sat in my chair in the silence of my home, I whispered once more to my wife that I had done as she wished, that I had stood strong, and I prayed that perhaps one day he would look back on this moment, not with anger, but with understanding. Though whether that day would come, I could not know. And so I remained firm, knowing that his shock was only the beginning of a change he had to face alone, and though he might curse my name in the meantime, I carried with me the peace of knowing I had protected her legacy and taught the lesson that had been too long delayed. The public unmasking came sooner than I expected, for it was during a family gathering meant to honor the memory of my wife that the truth of my son's greed revealed itself before everyone. And I remember walking into that room filled with cousins, nieces, and nephews, and lifelong friends, the air thick with the warmth of shared history and the ache of shared grief. And yet beneath the polite conversations and careful smiles I could sense tension, because word had already spread of my son's boasts, and many had come not only to pay respects, but to see with their own eyes how the matter of inheritance would unfold. And as the evening wore on, my son, fueled by pride and perhaps a touch of drink, began to speak loudly about the fortune he was soon to command. and he bragged of investments he planned to make, vacations he would take, and gifts he would bestow upon those who aligned themselves with him. And though some laughed uncomfortably, others shifted in their seats, glancing at me with unease, and I sat quietly for as long as I could, letting him weave his web of arrogance, because I knew that silence would only sharpen the blade of truth when the moment came. And that moment arrived when one of my cousins, a man who had known me since childhood, asked directly how I felt about my son's grand plans, and the room grew still, all eyes turning to me, and I rose slowly, my hands trembling not from fear but from the weight of what I was about to do, and I spoke clearly so that every ear could hear, telling them that my wife had left everything solely to me, that her will had been read and honored, and that I had secured the fortune beyond the reach of anyone who would misuse it. And I looked directly at my son as I said these words, watching the color drain from his face as the murmurs rippled through the room, and then I went on to speak of the truth, of how he had come to me not with comfort after his mother's passing but with demands, of how he had threatened to cut me off from my grandchildren, of how he had tried to bend me with ultimatums. And the shock on the faces around us told me they had not expected such revelations, for many had believed his tales, but now they saw clearly, and his wife shifted uncomfortably beside him, her practiced smile faltering, and my son's hands clenched at his sides as though he could still grasp the fortune slipping from his reach. But there was no grasping now, only exposure, and I told them all that I would not betray my wife's memory, that the wealth was not a prize for arrogance but a legacy to be guarded, and that I would rather endure loneliness than surrender to greed, and the room was silent when I finished. The kind of silence that speaks louder than applause. And though my son tried to recover, tried to laugh it off and accuse me of dramatics, the faces of those around us told him the damage was done, and in that moment his image crumbled, his boasts revealed as lies, his pride stripped bare for all to see, and I sat back down feeling both sorrow and relief. Sorrow because no father wishes to shame his son, and relief because the truth had finally been spoken. And as the evening went on, the conversations shifted away from him, leaving him and his wife isolated in the corner, their arrogance exposed to the very people whose respect they had once craved. And though my heart ached, I knew it was necessary, for some truths must be spoken in the open, so they cannot be denied. And that night I returned home tired but at peace, knowing that the mask had been removed and that the world now saw him not as he wished to be seen, but as he truly was. The fall of arrogance was not a loud crash, but a slow unraveling, and in the days after the gathering I began to hear how my son and his wife found themselves abandoned by the very people they once tried to impress. For the friends who had listened eagerly to his boasts no longer called, the relatives who had once entertained his arrogance now avoided him, and the invitations that once filled their calendar vanished into silence. And I could imagine him waking in the morning still clinging to the illusion that he could recover, only to find the world colder than before. And though I take no joy in the suffering of my child, I knew this was the natural consequence of pride laid bare, and I heard whispers that his business partners withdrew promises, that his wife complained bitterly about the humiliation, and that their once grand image began to crumble with each passing day. And I thought of how many times I had tried to warn him that respect cannot be demanded, it must be earned. And now he was learning that lesson not from me, but from the judgment of those around him. And I pictured him walking into rooms where once he had boasted of his inheritance, now met with skeptical glances and whispered conversations. And I wondered if he thought back to the moment I had stood before the family and spoken the truth, if he realized that his downfall began not with my refusal, but with his own arrogance. And while part of me grieved for the distance between us, another part of me hoped that humility might finally find its way into his heart, though whether it would I could not say. And his wife, who once carried herself with smug certainty, now found her own circle turning away. For greed leaves a mark that is hard to wash off, and those who had once envied her now pitied her, and pity is far colder than envy. And as their world shrank, I carried on with mine, quiet and steady, walking through the same house filled with memories of my wife, sitting by her chair, lighting the candle, whispering to her that the storm had broken and that we had endured. And though loneliness still pressed upon me, I found comfort in knowing that the legacy was preserved, that the lesson had been delivered, and that respect had triumphed over greed. And when neighbors spoke to me with kind words about my strength, I nodded humbly, for I did not feel strong, only resolute, and I thought of how life often brings us to crossroads where love and discipline meet, where the heart aches, but the hand must remain firm. And I realized this was such a moment, a test not only of my son, but of me. And though I wished he had chosen differently, I knew I could not walk his path for him. He had to face the fall himself, and so I let the silence teach him. I let the absence of admiration and the sting of lost respect show him what I could not. And while his pride cracked and his circle dwindled, I held to the promise I had made to my wife, to guard the legacy we had built. And as the days turned to weeks, I felt the truth settle deeper in me, that sometimes a father's greatest act of love is not in giving, but in refusing, not in sheltering, but in allowing the fall. For only through the fall can a man see the ground he stands upon, and only then can he decide whether to rise with humility or remain broken in pride. The final word is mine to speak. And as I sit here in the quiet of my home, I feel the weight of all that has happened, the grief of losing my wife, the sting of betrayal from my son, the coldness of my daughter-in-law, the threats, the ultimatums, and the lonely nights that followed. Yet alongside that sorrow rests a calm pride, because I know I did what was right. And when I look back across the long path of my life, I see not the fortune itself, but the labor that built it, the calloused hands, the tired eyes, the sacrifices shared with my wife who stood beside me through every storm. And I remember her laughter, her wisdom, her strength, and I know that guarding what she left behind was more than a duty. It was an act of love. And though my son may curse my name or call me selfish, I see clearly now that his anger is not a reflection of my failure as a father, but of his own blindness. For respect cannot be bought, love cannot be demanded, and gratitude cannot be faked. And as I sit by her chair lighting the candle she once lit each evening, I whisper to her that I have kept my promise, that I did not bend to greed, that I stood firm against threats, and that I carried her legacy as she trusted me to do. And in that whisper I feel her presence, not in flesh but in spirit, as though she leans close and reminds me that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it simply endures. And I think of my grandchildren and the hope that one day they will understand, that one day they will see past the bitterness of their father and know that their grandfather acted out of love, not spite. And I pray that the lesson of this story will reach them, that they will grow with humility rather than arrogance, with respect rather than entitlement. And though I cannot know what the future holds, I rest in the truth that I have done all I could, that I did not surrender her memory to the hunger of others. And as the night deepens and the clock ticks steadily, I realize that the wealth itself is not the true inheritance. The true inheritance is dignity, integrity, and the courage to stand firm even when the storm comes from within your own family. And so I close this chapter not with bitterness but with resolve, because I have learned that love and respect are worth more than any sum of money. And though I walk these halls alone, I do so with the pride of a man who has defended his wife's legacy, reclaimed his dignity, and proven that even in the twilight of life, a man's choices can echo louder than his years. And that is my final word. Yet as I say these words aloud to myself, I realize that my life still holds meaning beyond this conflict. For the lessons I have carried may one day guide others who face the same trials. And I know that wealth can build walls, but it can also build bridges if placed in the right hands. And so I have begun to think of how best to use what remains in my care, not as a weapon in family battles, but as a beacon for those in need, perhaps to fund scholarships for children who dream as mine once dreamed, perhaps to build a place of refuge where families can heal rather than divide. And in these thoughts, I find comfort because I know that Ligak, Y, is not measured only by the money we leave, but by the lives we touch. And if my grandchildren one day hear of how their grandfather chose to honor integrity above greed, then perhaps they will carry that torch forward. And even if they do not know the full story, even if their father paints me as a stubborn old man, time itself has a way of revealing truth, and truth, like light, cannot be hidden forever. And when that light shines, I hope it shows them that I loved them enough to stand tall, that I loved their grandmother enough to keep her wishes sacred, and that I loved myself enough to not be broken by threats. And so, as I sit in the fading glow of evening, I find peace in knowing that though my days may be numbered, the echo of my choices will live on, not in bitterness, not in anger, but in the quiet certainty that I chose respect over ease, love over surrender, and dignity over greed. And for a man who has seen much and endured more, there can be no greater inheritance to leave behind than that truth. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.